Have you ever stared up at the night sky, lost in the infinite darkness scattered with distant stars, and asked yourself, does the universe know I'm looking at it? At first, it might sound like a poetic or even childlike thought, but this question is, in fact, the doorway to one of the most profound and disturbing mysteries in modern science and philosophy. What if the universe is conscious? This isn't just about human or animal awareness. We're talking about the staggering idea that consciousness, some form of it, however primitive, may be embedded within the very fabric of reality. That atoms, particles, and even stars might possess some rudimentary sense of experience. This is the foundation of Panpsychism, a radical yet increasingly discussed theory suggesting that consciousness isn't a rare anomaly in the cosmos, but a fundamental and omnipresent feature of existence. We are living in an age of breathtaking scientific discovery. We've decoded DNA, photographed black holes, and sent probes beyond the solar system. Yet, the greatest mystery of all, consciousness, remains largely unsolved. Where does it come from? How does it arise? And why do we experience it? Traditional science tells us that consciousness is a product of complex neural interactions in the brain, that it's something the brain does. But Panpsychism flips this idea on its head. What if consciousness didn't suddenly emerge with the human brain? What if it has always been present in everything? This isn't just a New Age idea or spiritual speculation. Ancient philosophers like Thales of Miletus once claimed that everything is full of gods, hinting at a universe infused with awareness. In recent years, thinkers like physicist David Bohm and philosopher Galen Strawson have revived this notion, suggesting that consciousness may be a fundamental building block of nature, not something created, but something that was always there. According to Strawson, it's more reasonable to assume that consciousness is everywhere than to believe it magically pops into existence when matter reaches a certain level of complexity. But what would it actually mean to believe that the universe is conscious? This question doesn't just change how we understand physics. It has the power to completely shift our worldview, from how we treat nature to how we view life, death, and our place in the cosmos. This video isn't just a scientific inquiry. It's a philosophical, emotional, and even spiritual journey. In the next segments, we'll dive deep into the Panpsychist theory, what it proposes, the evidence that supports it, the arguments against it, and ultimately, the massive implications it holds for our lives and the future of science. If you're watching this, it means you're ready to step into a world where reality is far stranger and more mysterious than you've ever imagined. This isn't about easy answers or simple truths. It's about challenging everything we think we know and exploring a possibility that could change the very foundation of science and human thought. Because if there's even a small chance that the universe is conscious, then everything, and I mean everything, changes. And perhaps the real question isn't, is the universe conscious, but rather, are we conscious enough to recognize it? What is Panpsychism? To truly grasp the bold claim that the universe might be conscious, we need to first unpack the idea of Panpsychism, a term derived from the Greek words pan, meaning all, and psyche, meaning soul or mind. At its core, Panpsychism is the philosophical view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous aspect of the universe. It's not just something that appears inside human brains, but rather something that exists in all matter, at every level. From the tiniest subatomic particles to the vast swirling galaxies, everything might possess a tiny spark of awareness. Not necessarily thoughts, emotions, or memories like ours, but some primal, proto-conscious experience. Think of it like this. Instead of assuming that matter is inert and lifeless until it reaches a complex enough arrangement to produce consciousness, as the dominant scientific view holds, Panpsychism suggests that consciousness was never created. It has always been there. It's not an emergent property of brains. It's a built-in feature of the cosmos, just like space, time, or mass. This flips one of the most deeply rooted assumptions in science, that consciousness is exceptional, rare, and only found in a narrow range of biological life forms. If Panpsychism is correct, consciousness is not the exception, it is the rule. This idea may sound bizarre, but it solves a very real and persistent problem in philosophy and neuroscience: the hard problem of consciousness. Coined by philosopher David Chalmers, the hard problem refers to the fact that no matter how much we learn about the physical processes in the brain, we still can't explain why or how those processes result in subjective experience. We can track neural activity, measure brainwaves, and map thoughts to regions of the cortex, but we still have no clue why it feels like something to be conscious. Why is there a first-person perspective at all? Panpsychism offers a radical solution. Maybe we're struggling to explain consciousness because we're looking in the wrong place. Maybe it's not generated by the brain at all. Maybe the brain is simply organizing and focusing a form of awareness that already exists in the building blocks of matter. Historically, this idea has deep roots. Some of the earliest thinkers, like Plato and the Stoics, believed in a kind of world soul, a conscious principle that permeated all things. Later, philosophers like Baruch Spinoza in the 17th century proposed that mind and matter were two sides of the same coin. In more recent decades, figures like Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell advanced similar views under different names, suggesting that mental properties could be inherent in all entities. Even in Eastern philosophies, such as certain forms of Buddhism and Hinduism, the belief that consciousness is universal and foundational is deeply embedded. So, while panpsychism might seem cutting edge or even fringe in today's scientific context, it's actually a revival of an ancient and recurring intuition about the nature of reality. In the modern era, panpsychism has gained traction among a growing number of scientists and philosophers who are dissatisfied with materialism, the belief that only physical matter exists and that everything, including consciousness, can be explained in purely physical terms. Figures like Philip Goff, Hedda Hasselmuth, and Galen Strawson argue that materialism has failed to account for the existence of consciousness in any meaningful way. They suggest that by acknowledging consciousness as a fundamental aspect of reality, we can begin to bridge the gap between physics and subjective experience. For them, consciousness is as basic as space, time, or gravity, a core ingredient of the cosmos itself. But what kind of consciousness are we talking about? Surely electrons aren't having thoughts or emotions, right? Of course not. Panpsychism doesn't claim that all matter has human-like consciousness. Instead, it suggests that even the most basic particles might have extremely simple forms of experience, something akin to a faint spark of awareness. It's not consciousness as we know it, but something far more rudimentary. When these particles combine into more complex systems, like brains, their individual experiences might integrate into the rich inner life we associate with being human. This idea, called constitutive panpsychism, attempts to explain how microconsciousness might build into macroconsciousness, much like atoms combine to form molecules, and molecules to form cells. In this way, panpsychism provides a coherent framework that unifies the mental and physical without reducing one to the other. It avoids the pitfalls of dualism, the idea that mind and matter are entirely separate, and escapes the limitations of reductive materialism. It dares to suggest that the universe is not a dead machine, but a living tapestry of experiences, a cosmic symphony of awareness unfolding at every scale. It invites us to consider that perhaps we don't live in a conscious universe. Maybe we live as part of one. Scientific and philosophical evidence for panpsychism. Panpsychism is not just a poetic philosophy or a metaphysical hunch. Over the years, it has gathered attention because it offers real solutions to serious gaps in our scientific understanding of consciousness. As strange as it may sound, this theory might actually be more rational than the prevailing views in neuroscience and physics. To understand why, we must examine the evidence, not just in terms of experiments, but in how panpsychism solves long-standing paradoxes and bridges the explanatory void between mind and matter. In many ways, it offers what no other theory of consciousness has been able to: a complete and consistent account of why conscious experience exists at all. Let's begin with the failure of physicalism. For decades, scientists have tried to explain consciousness through purely material processes: neurons firing, synapses connecting, brain chemicals flowing. This approach has been incredibly successful in explaining behavior, but not experience. Despite billions spent on brain research, no one has been able to explain the inner world, what it's like to see red, feel pain, or remember a dream. This is the essence of the hard problem of consciousness, as defined by philosopher David Chalmers. He argues that no matter how much we study the brain's mechanics, we can never derive the feeling of consciousness from purely physical facts. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's been blind from birth. This is where panpsychism steps in, not to reject science but to complete it. If consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter, then it doesn't need to emerge from complexity. It was always there, hidden in plain sight. Philosopher Galen Strawson reinforces this view with a powerful argument. He claims that it is more absurd to think that matter, at some point, magically becomes conscious, than to believe that some form of consciousness is already intrinsic to matter. He calls the idea that consciousness emerges from non-conscious stuff a kind of modern-day alchemy, a belief in magical transformation. To avoid this, Strawson proposes a realistic physicalism where all matter has some form of experience. It's not about assigning feelings to rocks or emotions to atoms, but acknowledging that even the most basic building blocks of the universe might possess some degree of internality, however faint or simple. But what about science? Is there any empirical evidence pointing toward a conscious universe? The answer is subtle. While there's no definitive consciousness detector, several discoveries in quantum physics have pushed scientists toward interpretations that eerily resemble panpsychist ideas. Take the observer effect in quantum mechanics. Particles don't seem to exist in a definite state until they're observed. The famous double-slit experiment shows that light behaves like a wave until someone measures it, at which point it behaves like a particle. This raises the unnerving question: what counts as an observation? Does the particle know it's being watched? While mainstream science doesn't go so far, some interpretations, like consciousness causes collapse theories, suggest that awareness might play a fundamental role in shaping physical reality. Then there's integrated information theory, IIT, a modern attempt to mathematically define consciousness. Proposed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, IIT states that any system that integrates information, regardless of what it's made of, possesses some degree of consciousness. According to this theory, a brain is conscious because it integrates information in complex ways. But here's the catch. IIT implies that even very simple systems like computer chips or single cells could have tiny bits of consciousness. This aligns perfectly with panpsychism, which holds that consciousness comes in degrees and scales with complexity. IIT doesn't call itself panpsychist, but many philosophers argue that its implications are fundamentally panpsychist at their core. There's also compelling neurological evidence that supports the non-local nature of consciousness. Studies of brain injuries and split brain patients reveal that consciousness doesn't reside in one specific part of the brain. Instead, it appears to be a distributed phenomenon, one that emerges from the complex interactions of many parts, yet isn't owned by any one region. This supports the idea that consciousness might not be localized at all, that it could, in some sense, be a field or a process we tap into. This is remarkably similar to panpsychist interpretations of reality, where awareness exists everywhere, but only becomes complex enough to be self-aware in certain configurations. Even artificial intelligence research is contributing to this debate. As we build increasingly complex machines, the question becomes, when do they become conscious? Some argue that it's not about intelligence or behavior, but about internal structure. If machines process information in the right way, could they feel something? If so, does this mean consciousness can emerge from silicon as well as carbon? Or is it already there, waiting to be organized? These questions, while unanswered, reflect a growing realization in science that consciousness may not be an emergent oddity, but a pervasive principle. Lastly, let's not forget the subjective evidence, our own experiences. While not scientific in the traditional sense, the fact that we have conscious awareness at all is perhaps the strongest clue that something deeper is at play. We don't just move through the world reacting to stimuli, we feel it. We dream, imagine, and reflect. Where does this come from? If consciousness were just a byproduct of neurons, we should be able to build machines with identical inner lives. Yet we haven't, and maybe we can't, because something fundamental is missing from our equations: the experience itself. In short, panpsychism doesn't come out of nowhere. It arises from the cracks in our existing theories, the unanswered questions that traditional science continues to struggle with. It aligns with ancient wisdom, modern physics, and the latest philosophical thought. And perhaps most importantly, it offers a bold, unified framework for understanding reality. One where matter is not mute and mindless, but alive with potential. Objections and counter-arguments to panpsychism. As intriguing as panpsychism is, it hasn't risen to prominence without resistance. For many scientists and philosophers, the idea that everything, from electrons to black holes, possesses some form of consciousness feels like a step backward into animism or mysticism. The modern scientific worldview has worked hard to strip nature of intention and mind, replacing it with objective measurement and predictable laws. Reintroducing consciousness into the fundamental fabric of reality seems to blur the line between rigorous science and spiritual speculation. But let's take a closer look. Are these objections rooted in logic or in a bias against mystery? One of the primary criticisms leveled at panpsychism is the so-called combination problem. If individual particles have some proto-consciousness, how do these micro-experiences combine to form the unified, rich conscious experience we know as the human mind? For instance, if a single electron has a flicker of awareness, what happens when trillions of them assemble into a brain? How do their simple experiences bind together to create a coherent self, a mind with memory, emotion, and self-reflection? This is not a trivial question. Even defenders of panpsychism admit that the combination problem is its most serious challenge. Philosopher David Chalmers has compared it to the hard problem of consciousness itself, but at a deeper, structural level. Some critics argue that panpsychism is unfalsifiable, meaning it can't be tested or proven wrong, which places it outside the domain of science. This is a serious charge in scientific circles, where empirical testing is the gold standard of truth. If you can't build an experiment to confirm or disprove a theory, many scientists would argue it doesn't belong in science at all. However, defenders of panpsychism respond by pointing out that none of the major theories of consciousness, including physicalism, have yet produced a definitive, testable model of subjective experience. Consciousness, by its very nature, is hard to measure. So perhaps panpsychism isn't alone in this regard, and its apparent unfalsifiability is more a reflection of the subject than the theory itself. Another common objection is that panpsychism is too radical, that it contradicts everything we know about the physical world. But this argument, though emotional in tone, doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Remember, science has often been forced to accept radical revisions of its worldview. Just think about quantum mechanics, which shattered classical notions of locality and determinism, or relativity, which redefined space and time themselves. What seems crazy at first often becomes foundational later. Panpsychism may feel counterintuitive, but that doesn't make it wrong. In fact, its ability to explain what other models can't, particularly the existence of experience itself, gives it a certain scientific elegance. Some materialist philosophers go further, insisting that consciousness is merely a neural illusion, a byproduct of brain computation with no real substance. According to this view, our sense of self and awareness is just a trick of the brain, a narrative created for evolutionary purposes. But this raises a paradox. If consciousness is an illusion, who is experiencing the illusion? Illusions still require a witness. This self-defeating logic leads many to abandon eliminative materialism in favor of more robust explanations like panpsychism, which at least acknowledges the reality of conscious experience instead of trying to deny it. A deeper, more subtle criticism of panpsychism is that it fails to clarify the nature of consciousness itself. Saying that all matter is conscious doesn't explain what consciousness is. It just extends its domain. It shifts the problem instead of solving it. But this criticism might miss the point. Panpsychism doesn't claim to know the final truth about mind and matter. Instead, it proposes a framework, a new lens through which to understand the unity of reality. It tells us that consciousness isn't an emergent trick of complexity, but a baseline property of existence. The challenge of defining consciousness remains, but at least it becomes a universal challenge, not just a glitch in brains. There's also a cultural resistance. The scientific community is deeply entrenched in reductionism, the belief that complex phenomena can always be explained by simpler parts. In this model, the brain is just a machine, the mind just software, and consciousness just an output. But reductionism has its limits. It struggles to account for first-person experience. No matter how many neural pathways we map or molecules we count, we still haven't touched the feeling of being alive. Panpsychism, by contrast, starts from the inside. It assumes experience is real and tries to build a cosmos around that fact. In doing so, it challenges not just the structure of science, but its spirit. Finally, there's the emotional objection. If everything is conscious, does that make us less special? Does it mean that rocks and rivers are somehow alive? That idea can be unsettling, but also deeply humbling. Panpsychism doesn't diminish humanity. It connects us to everything. It suggests that we are not isolated flukes of awareness, but participants in a vast conscious unfolding. From atoms to stars, everything may shimmer with some hidden spark. And perhaps that's not madness. Perhaps it's truth seen through a different lens. In the end, many of the criticisms against panpsychism boil down to discomfort, with ambiguity, with mystery, with rewriting the rules. But the same was true for every great revolution in thought. Whether or not panpsychism is correct, it deserves a place at the table, not as pseudoscience, but as a legitimate, daring attempt to answer the oldest question of all: why do we feel anything at all? So, after all the theories, the paradoxes, and the debates, we arrive at a breathtaking possibility. What if the universe is not a cold, dead machine, but a living, conscious being? What if every atom pulses with a hidden awareness? What if the stars we gaze upon are not just burning spheres of gas, but expressions of a deeper cosmic mind, a mind in which we are embedded? Here's the question that should haunt us. If consciousness is not something we have, but something we are, and if the universe itself shares in that awareness, then what does that make you? A fragment of the cosmos? Or the cosmos awakening to itself? This isn't just philosophy. It's a mirror held up to your soul. If panpsychism is true, then your thoughts, your dreams, your sense of self are not accidental. They're echoes of the universe thinking through you. Your consciousness is not a glitch in evolution. It is the thread that connects you to everything, to the humming of electrons, the breath of trees, the silence between galaxies. But here's the challenge. Will you dare to live as if the universe is conscious? Will you treat existence not as machinery but as meaning? Will you ask deeper questions, seek inner stillness, and respect the sacredness of even the smallest things? Because if the cosmos is alive, then so is your life. Every choice you make ripples through a web of conscious being. Every act of wonder, of creativity, of love, becomes not just yours, but the universe expressing itself through you. So I invite you now to share your awakening. Comment below. I am a spark of the conscious universe. If this idea moved you, if it made you pause and feel the weight of your existence in a new light, let's build a community of minds who dare to question the nature of reality and feel the pulse beneath it all. And don't forget, subscribe to the Power of Science for more mind-bending explorations into consciousness, space, time, and the mysterious beauty of our universe. Turn on the notification bell, because the next question we explore might just change the way you see everything.